A striking number of people have been leaving the Democratic Party in the last 10 years. A short list includes RFK, Jordan Peterson, Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, Bill Maher, Dave Rubin, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Andrew Yang, Joe Rogan, J.K. Rowling, and my guest today, Anthony Rispo. Anthony, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me on, Kirk. This is great.
So my first question is why are so many Americans, men, women, black, white, rich, poor, gay, straight, leaving the party?
Well, I can center this based on my own experience and maybe go outward from there. Because like you'd mentioned, all these figures, these public figures, there's been a noticeable shift in them leaving, quote, leaving the party. Bill Maher, of course, says that the party left him. It's not so clear if what's happening, what direction, where people are going, if they're leaving or if it's leaving. I tend to think it's a mix. For myself, I think, again, just to anchor the question, or to answer the question in a more anchored way, for me, it was cognitive dissonance. It was disorienting in 2020 to experience, well, for all of us, I think, the pandemic was disorienting. But on top of that, to compound the disorienting experience, was the social upheaval continued. And we had an array of issues, from public health policy to protests around Black Lives Matter, and people were, stuck in the house. And so there's all these different converging points coming together that activates the human person, right? The human being to, want to act out. And so I think what happened is people started to see from a distance in a more still kind of manner. Like, again, speaking for myself, being at home, I did not do protesting. At the time, I was more on the political left, to kind of, reinforce what you're saying here. And I just saw the kinds of behaviors that you would normally think you would see with people who are just generally emotionally dysregulated, who probably have like sort of characterological issues going on, where they, and it's taken me a while to say this, as I say it with such certainty, but people who need actually certainty, who need to feel like they're getting out there to ameliorate the suffering of society, of a certain subset of people. And the same thing happened with people who were protesting masks and all that. But at large, we saw huge amounts of people coming out for Black Lives Matter and the social issues. And the sort of instruments that they use to impose sort of social costs on people who would not comply was very dissonant to me, and something that I couldn't get on board with. So that's sort of a long, drawn-out answer to say, or explanation for, it was just a lot of cognitive dissonance on my end. I felt very at odds with the way that whole movement was, carried out, and so it just made me think about my own thinking and like how I feel about social issues, what a society should do about these things, and then to zero in on it, what actually is even the problem? What are we protesting? What are we getting upset about? And then when you start to click on that and see that, well, cops are actually not killing Black men and women, Black Americans at the rates that were expressed at the time, then more dissonance. So I think from my experience, it was dissonance. And then I can't speak for the folks that you mentioned, but I think that the same could be said for them to some degree. Of course, there's the issue of, an Overton window effect, where we thought the Overton window had shifted in favor of defunding the police, but in fact, things stopped and slowed down, and people got to think about it, and perhaps it did not shift in that direction. And then the dissonance settles in, and then you think, I guess it didn't settle in that direction. Popular opinion is that we should not be defunding the police. Around that time, a Gallup poll came out showing that upwards of, I think, 80, I don't want to mischaracterize or misquote, but 80-something% of Black Americans overall just didn't want to defund the police. So I think people were being exposed to the contradicting viewpoint, the viewpoint that was contradicting sort of a social mandate that was being cast on us by, social justice warriors and BLM and the like. So, we could riff off that, but that's a general feature of what happened to me.
Interesting. So it sounds like this cognitive dissonance that you're talking about,
Yeah.
where you knew one thing to be true, but it almost seems like this other thing is being portrayed in the media. There was some tipping point there. What was that tipping point for you?
Yeah. So for me, it was more personal. I was involved in, I guess you can call them different social justice endeavors. And in my local town,
You were a social justice warrior.
I was. Well, I know it's like I don't want to I don't want to deny it, but I wasn't. I guess I wasn't rah-rah, but I was definitely playing the part.
Sure.
Though I never really identified, and we can get into that at some point, perhaps. But I never really identified with the sort of personality style or the movement, or it just never. I was, but that's kind of a feature of my personality. I never clung on to like groups or anything like that, but I did jump in the ring a bit, and I took part in with people who were trying to get rid of the Indians mascot at the high school where I live, and so it was an initiative to do that, led by a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, white male, gay male, PhD in public health, and rallied a bunch of people together on Google Docs to try to reprimand the superintendent. And so we all hopped on this Google Docs. This was the pandemic, and we couldn't meet in person, so we all hopped on this Google Doc and would collaborate on writing a letter to the administration of the high school. And it was just really petty and catty and really rude, and didn't seem to be kind of a convincing way to portray your argument of like why we should do this, why we should not have this, what is a better alternative. It was very punitive, and it wasn't the right approach. And I addressed that. I'd mentioned that. But then the infighting ensued. There was a lot of infighting and overcorrecting within the group, basically saying, we're not being hard enough, or we shouldn't be letting them get away with it. Just kind of very punitive, like I mentioned. And there just didn't seem to be any room for diplomacy, for any reaching out and to kind of like bridging differences. And so it failed. But I mean, eventually, years later, it actually ended up. They actually ended up getting rid of the Indians mascot. But the point of dissonance was that there were tribes in the region that, some were fine with it, but meaning they were fine with the initiative to get rid of it. But there were quite a few who said that, this is pretty inconsequential. So it was that moment when I started to think, why are a bunch of white kids pushing for some kind of strategy to, ameliorate the suffering in retrospect of this, demographic. And meanwhile, that very demographic is basically saying, this is not that much of a big deal. And that was sort of resounding throughout the country. You had kind of people who were in tribes who were for it, who didn't care about it. And it made me think, well, there has to be something here there's a differential here going on. It can't just be that because you're BIPOC or whatever, it automatically means that you believe in this initiative. There's got to be something going on. And that's when I started to get into like trying to understand ideology more and how ideology is really independent of race and ethnicity and background, that if you're conservative and black, you're conservative and black. You have more in common ideologically with someone who's conservative and white. If you're black and liberal or progressive, then you have more in common with someone who's white and progressive. I mean, it's kind of a simple way of thinking about it, but that was the point of, that was the divergence. It was like, oh, a moment that, something as simple as that I hadn't thought about. But
interesting.
It's pretty, when you think about it, it's pretty freaking simple.
That whole takeover of the mascots. The only time I really got annoyed by it was I'm a big skier, and we went to Tahoe a lot, and there was a mountain there called Squaw. And Squaw obviously has some connotations back to Native Americans in that area. They petitioned to change the name, and they made it literally the whitest name you could ever come up with, Palisades.
Yeah.
Okay. And now there's no connection to the local people for that mountain. The kids
Yeah.
that go now, starting in 13, 14, 15, they don't know that there was a connection there between the Native Americans and the mountain. And so for me, I'm like, well, what did we achieve here? What did we achieve by changing the name? We got rid of the history that belonged to the people, the
Yeah.
Native American people.
Yeah.
So interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Why do people listen to you so much? You've accumulated this following.
Mm-hmm.
Give yourself a little bit of a brag here about why is what you say so important? What have you achieved? And what is your social media platform aiming to do?
All really great questions. And to be very humbly honest with you, I'm still trying to figure some of that out because in truth, the backstory is, and I'll make it brief, is in March this year, I was at Columbia. I graduated in May, and there were, the campus protests going on, and it got really rowdy, and it really intruded on or impeded the flow of the university life, culture, and just kind of just really put a wrench in the gears for everyone. And I made a very quick video about how, well, actually there was an article that came out by Ricky Schlott from the New York Post talking about the problem with people, incoming students. Like there are fewer people who are applying or who actually would get in and denied their acceptance because of what was going on, and that Columbia was also softening its acceptance. People who would come into the school, and that seemed like a very big problem. And I kind of have any empirical sort of wisdom to make this point definitively, but it did seem to me to be the case that, well, I would venture to say that it's because of the protests and parents don't want their kids coming here and spending money on a place that's sort of in disarray.
Mm-hmm.
So I said all of that in like 30 seconds. Basically, the people who are coming here to pay good money to come here, what does that mean for us? It's about like 25 to 30 second clip. And that generated somewhat of an interest in my page. And I only had around 700 followers at the time. And then at that point, 1,000 views, several hundred likes. That was pretty big for relative to my page at the time, or my Instagram account. And so I sort of thought, all right, I'm graduating. I have a few things that I'd like to think about doing, moving on from this school and from my life here. But also, this is a window of time where I can use the platform to start a discussion broadly about political psychology, about social psychology, personality, so just different things, different domains of psychology that I'd been sampling while at Columbia and prior also. So I jumped in and I just decided to keep going with it. And I wanted to address fundamentally the asymmetry in the research programs in social psychology. And the long and short of it is basically that the academia, the academy skews very liberal, people don't like these terms, liberal, progressive. It's like, this is we're jumbled around with this terminology, but I'm going to use liberal for now for listeners to mean, the progressive ilk and that side of things.
Sure.
And it's heavily skewed liberal, and there's a whole sort of field in psychology, measurement validity. It would be considered philosophy of science also, or just psychologists that focus on how things are measured in the field, specifically in social psychology, how terms are operationalized, measured, how assumptions that, kind of set the stage for hypotheses, kind of this idea of something. We're trying to understand racism. We're trying to understand where it exists in society. Well, the assumption is that it does exist in this particular spot. So now we have that assumption. Now we're just going to measure it. But that's circular reasoning to some degree, and also makes the entire question or venture into that question unfalsifiable, because you have to lead with curiosity, and you have to be open to your assumptions being wrong. But if you lead believing that your assumptions are actually ipso facto just like reality at face value, then you're going to get that when you measure it, and your conclusions are, oh, by the way, my assumptions were right. And so social psychologists not only live and breathe in the culture that they feel most comfortable, the liberal academic environment, but they're also there's an incentive. Of course, there's the research paper incentive to produce as much research as you can, to kind of meet a quota, if you will, because also your grant money depends on that, right? And then there's the social structure of your persona. You want to really be at the leading edge of what's going on culturally as a social psychologist. So there's a whole bunch of different things. And I wanted to highlight to people that, taken together, this is social psychology, and not to denigrate it too much or to be disparaging, but this is the domain of psychology that from which its findings downstream from that, you get things like DEI, you get defund the police, you get mandating the use of pronouns being permeating into law, like in New York City in 2016 when the administration at the time, New York City mayoral administration, decided that it would be a good idea to make it a law to fine you up to $250,000 if you mischaracterize someone, even if you forget the second time, something like that. You can look up the law. But all these that's to say, all of these policies, all these ideas, it's not that they entirely fall from the tree of social psychology singularly, but because social psychology, unlike, I don't know, the humanities or even to some degree sociology, because social psychology is empirical in its pursuit, that it looks not only qualitatively but quantitatively, and it postures itself as a science with statistical analyses. You can make inferences from that kind of thing, and it can be dangerous because, well, if the science says, then we ought to follow the science, right? But of course, these are the same people who, I won't get into that, but when it comes to things like gender affirming care, they'll want to trust the science. But it just so happens that the same kind of social psychology science is what really predicates this notion that we ought to implement gender affirming care because it reduces harm. But when you look at the science, you see the asymmetry in the way it's designed. You see assumptions not tested. You see poor sampling. You see a whole hodgepodge of violations of the scientific method that you would not see, hopefully, you would not see in biology or other, more strict forms of analysis. So,
but because social psychology has a bit more of a looser barrier,
yeah,
you can play with those assumptions a bit more and still seem credible.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good way of putting it. The humanities, and also, I kind of, when I say the humanities and I single out sociology, I would consider it part of humanities for sure, but it also teeters the empirical to some degree. But you have a wave of social scientists. I guess I say this because you have people like Adorno, Marcuse, sort of the Frankfurt School types coming in with a very critical lens, just of culture in general. Like Adorno was a critic of culture, but he was also the one who devised the F scale, which is the fascist scale, which basically positioned conservatism as by default fascism to some degree or another. And then you had social psychologists by the name of Altemeyer, who then said, well, this psychometrically Adorno's work is not solid, so let's make it more solid. And he came up with the right-wing authoritarianism construct and scale, and psychometrically validated it, if you will. But there are many problems with it still. Again, those assumptions about conservatism then being put to an empirical test to then render results that favor those assumptions about conservatives, with no symmetry. And so, to circle back to your question about this enterprise of social psychology, you have all this time of, social psychologists looking at right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation and all these different things that would then land on the heels of inevitably it's conservatism. Oh, it's conservatism, with no research program looking at a symmetrical, setting the stage symmetrically to see, does this exist on the left also? You don't see that until around 2016.
Wow.
Yeah, with left-wing authoritarianism.
So I've had friends say to me, I can't believe a gay person would vote conservative because they're voting against themselves. You're in a unique position, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You might even go person of color, definitely gay, and now conservative. Do you feel like you're voting against yourself when you vote conservative?
No, not at all. Because I separate because fundamentally, I believe that the way we think about conservatism is through this sort of Christian or ethnocentric Christian nationalist sort of lens. It's sort of a distortion of how I would argue that how this country was established on these sort of liberal, classically liberal tenets, that fall from, the concepts of the Enlightenment and everything from free markets to freedom of speech. To me, that seems pretty chill and pretty liberal. I mean, so I do not. I think that if you look at, and I don't claim to be a scholar on this person, but Edmund Burke, Parliament. He was part of the Parliament in England. I can't remember his years, but he was one of the first. And I'm not going to talk much on him because I'm just getting into him. But he was sort of, look him up, folks, who are listening. He's sort of a quintessential sort of Mitt Romney type.
Okay.
Lukewarm kind of. Because you think about someone like Mitt Romney, who was a champion of what we consider to be more of a universal type of healthcare, which is probably a misconception or a misnomer, but something that is sort of getting people to jump in and to buy into healthcare without mandating it in a way that would be like sort of along the lines of a dictatorship. Sort of a mandate was more self-imposed, where you want to actually motivate yourself to get health care. And that's the kind of politics that Edmund Burke was interested in, is sort of getting everybody to, more interested in being a participant of the system. And there's sort of a moral obligation there too, but it's not imposed on you. So that's a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's an important point of reference because I'm thinking about what does it mean to be conservative. And I think along those lines, along Locke, along Burke, along limited government and very thin parameters that are extremely Teflon, just very strong and straight freedom of speech. Like I said, your right to it's kind of like that natural law concept of you have the same value and inherent worth as the next person, and you have the right to just sort of defend yourself, for due process. All these things are, for me, what it means to be conservative, and also a free market system, which there's plenty of evidence to show that kind of a system works really well. It can also go sideways, but we've seen how other competing systems fall apart. And so to me, that's what it means. It means to not impose your own beliefs on another person and to force people to do the things you think they ought to do. There's that is ought principle that I think the Scottish Enlightenment theorists and thinkers didn't take it. They were not heavy on the ought part. The only sort of ought, I think, is that we ought to ensure we don't break the law or hurt anybody, and I think that it's pretty limited. And when you talk about conservatism now, though, it gets thrown around because you have you have a lot of people on the sort of on the right now who are fragmented, trying to figure out this very question. What is MAGA? Who is Nick Fuentes, and what does he mean to us? So I think it would be a point of major dissonance if someone like me, who's gay, sided entirely. In my view, it would be a major dissonance if someone like me sided with Nick Fuentes, because he's seeing the world, and especially this country, but the world broadly, through a sort of a caricature, I think, of something that I can't even put my finger on entirely. But
Well, let's talk about him, because the left, I've seen fissures for a while, for years now.
Yeah.
But recently, I'm talking the last couple of months, we've seen fissures in the right.
Yeah.
You've seen, infighting between, let's just say, Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro.
Oh, yeah.
Nick Fuentes went on Tucker Carlson and kind of created fissures there. What's going on there from, let's just say, a sociologically, psychological perspective?
Yeah.
And why is Nick gaining so much traction as basically a self-proclaimed Nazi?
Yeah. So why is there a fracture? I think when you have someone like Nick Fuentes up the volume, I actually think that people are claiming that his rise as of late has something to do with, unfortunately, Charlie Kirk's absence and his death, and
Someone's trying to fill the void.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it seems like someone like a Charlie Kirk was able to attenuate or counterbalance a Nick Fuentes, if you will. Because just as a preface to what I'm going to say, if you watch, people throw around clips of Charlie Kirk, just people who hate him, basically trying to find a gotcha moment to say, see, he was homophobic, racist, this, that. But you find clips of him, vehemently and passionately disagreeing with, even going so far as like socially punishing people who would get up and talk about homosexuality in a aversive way, or even race. And so you see the levees completely collapse with Nick Fuentes, who he's fine with all of that, and it's not hyperbole. Anybody can go and watch what he has said. And this is interesting, though, this question, because you asked what's going on, why is there a fracture? And again, I think it's the points of dissonance. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with you have sort of this populist movement that seems to, at this point, be indistinguishable. And by that, I mean the left and the right are now finally coming to the part of the horseshoe where they're at the same side. Because you have someone like Nick Fuentes who's hopping on these conspiracy theories about Israel, notwithstanding the fact that you can criticize, and I know this is a talking point, but that a lot of people regurgitate, and I'm not trying to do that. I think this is a fair point, that one can and ought to, if they feel so inclined, to criticize Israel on geopolitical matters and governmental matters or whatever, but to drop so low to the point where you're actually importing or taking old tried conspiracy tales and about the Jews and being these cunning people who are just out for it all, and making that your assumption, and then everything downstream is then validated. It's like, oh no, it's because they're trying to, don't you know, they're trying for world domination, and they've permeated every part of our society. That's our working model. So then everything from there, all my points make sense. They're colonizers. They're when you talk about the occupation, it's only through the lens of them subjugating. There's not ever a nuanced way of looking at it. So that's all to say, when you're working with this conspiracy model that's so bound together, and it's not only that. I mean, it's also, it kind of lands well on the heels of the typical very far right kinds of people who are very conspiratorial. They have this isolationist mindset, screw the rest of the world. And, they also, well, I don't know if this is the case with that group broadly speaking, but with Nick Fuentes, he's certainly very anti-neocon. Now, that's a point, I think, that where he gets a lot of people on his ship, is it's a generational thing where people my age, I'm 35, but and younger, even give or take older, younger, are indeed tired of wars, and that's a valid point. And we have seen the neocon wing of politics exposed more than we like to admit. I mean, 9/11, I was around for 9/11, Iraq, all that stuff. And when the country doesn't focus enough, when you start to see a net loss and you start to see that your country is not essentially living up to a certain standard it claims to live up to, and it's always at odds with those claims by showing that it'll do everything it can to pour money into wars and stuff like that. I mean, that's a grievance that I think a whole generation feels very inclined to express as a major problem. And he's tapping into something there. But I think that's his point of, that's his opening where he gets people, at least in my view, he gets people stuck on this idea that it could be, it's a very valid point. But then you get sort of sucked into the world of Nick Fuentes conspiracy land where, or just this rigid way of thinking about race and women, that I think he's talking to, and people make excuses for men often who listen to him. He's talking to people who are, quote, fatigued by, being diminished, or, white people who are tired of the woke mob diminishing them and sort of imposing labels on them, and tired of, being, simps and men who are made into emasculated. And I think that he's speaking to a frustration, but that doesn't mean that frustration holds weight for something that should be sympathized with. I think that there are other ways of dealing with those grievances. And so to come full circle, I think he's a grievance figure who just really pulls people into his world. And a lot of people made that point about Donald Trump, right? He's like denigrating all these people, scapegoating all these people. And it makes it very easy for people who are frustrated to begin with to then get sucked into his world. Right. But in looking back, I mean, you could see some of the antics of Donald Trump being somewhat of a, theatrical and somewhat of a problem in certain levels of analyses, but not like this person who quite literally talks about Black people and white people not sharing the same water fountains and that being okay. And why do we care about that? Let's not get over it like in terms of history, but like, why is it a bad thing even? It's like, well, dude, it's a pretty bad thing. It's dehumanizing. We're not talking about DEI here. We're not talking about a high level discussion about preferential treatment based on skin color that the left has employed for years, which is racist, or which, for all intents and purposes is the opposite of that which they're claiming to want to get rid of. We're talking about someone who's cool with, segregation. And I think that's a major problem. I think a lot of it has to do with psychologically. I can't speak for him or broadly to his profile psychologically, but I think a lot of it is because he was betrayed at a young age and sucked into the world of media and was very vocal when he was in college first year. And I think he was slapped around many times by big political and media figures. And I don't think he got over that. I think he harbors a lot of resentment, and I think
bit of a chip on his shoulder.
A big chip on his shoulder, I think. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned these grievance figures.
Yeah.
I've heard a couple people say with the grievance figures, they are great at identifying symptoms, but not diagnoses. For example, let's take a figure like Andrew Tate. He would come in and say something like, men feel dejected. And men would say, yeah, men aren't having sex. And it's true, a third of men last year between 20 and 30 haven't had sex. And they go, yeah. And he'd say these things. And then he'd say, therefore, women shouldn't vote and you should be able to hit them. And everyone would be like, well, hold on a second. But it's very easy when you have these dejected, lonely men to accept the first part and therefore by default accept the second. And I think there's this gray area that men have to be able to think for themselves and say, okay, part of this could be true, but that doesn't mean the whole thing is, right? And so with the grievance figure like Nick Fuentes, I think he's tapping into something that's very real, right? Yeah, who wants to see any more wars? But the implication of that is not to bring back segregation and become an isolationist, right? Like the big figure of America in the world playing Big Brother. It's an important role for the hegemony, right?
Yeah.
So
that's right.
One thing that I'm very interested in, and I've heard you talk briefly about this before, there's a Gallup poll And it says 58% of Republicans report having excellent mental health compared to just 38% of the Democratic Party. Additionally, 1 in 4 Democrats self-report having depression or severe mental health issues. There's some misnomers in there.
Yeah.
But what's the truth of it?
Yeah. So do you want me to address the truth first or the misnomers? Because they're both really important for a good symmetrical argument.
Let's hit both.
Okay. So the misnomers, I believe that was a 2008 Gallup poll. And so the question was about, I believe it was mental health, to self-report your mental health. And that there was quite a difference between the two. I think 58% or something of
58 and 38.
And 38, right. So the problem with that is that, well, first it's a poll that is asking a singular question about something extremely deep and important, and that gets to the root of a person. It's not an opinion poll. It's not something that is sort of temporal or kind of happening during the sort of beat of the day or the week or the season. When you're asking about someone's mental health,
it's a point in time.
It's really, you're not only dealing with something that could be experienced more saliently in a given moment, but underneath it, there's likely a trait component where the person generally, characterologically, personologically, just psychologically, psychiatrically, might have just a through line that's buzzing under them. It's not just at the state level. It's like somebody who's more predisposed to, someone who has a predisposition for a harder time to dysregulating their nervous system, high anxiety, high, negative emotionality, high neuroticism, trait neuroticism, which correlates pretty well with anxiety disorders, mood disorders. And so that's not something that's at the state level. In the moment, it can exacerbate during a given time. So if that poll was taken, I don't know what the context was, but it also doesn't make sense that. Well, I won't get into that. We'll trim that, and I'll get to a more coherent kind of synthesis of this, because it's important to differentiate, to challenge that poll with the new evidence that's out. So when you're asking a question like that, you're just going to get a very, first of all, low resolution answer, because it's self-report, which is pretty low resolution. And again, it's asking a question that's much deeper and requires more analysis. And so what actually a Johns Hopkins study came out, I think in 2024, showing after having kind of asked the same question, they found it was for they included political ideology in the study, but they used psychometrically strong tests to test anxiety, to test depressive symptoms.
Got it.
It was depressive symptoms, I believe, and they found that there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups. I think 28 to 26% showing depressive symptoms, liberals and conservatives. I think it was Democrats and Republicans or liberals. I can't remember how they did it, but the most important point is that they were about the same. And the 1 out of 4 figure pertains to all people who were measured. Yeah, the 1 out of 4 figure is not just for liberals. It was for all people who reported with high symptomatology and depressive symptoms. And so the interesting thing is just like how conservatives are asked about their mental health was one of the caveats that people looked into. Is if you ask a conservative to rate their mental health, a stigma is attached to it. I mean, it could be that people on the political right become irritated at the buzzword or the semantics of it, like mental health. Oh, that's something I take care of on my own. Right. Where when you ask about how you're feeling or mood, you change the question. you get less of a bias response. You get a more authentic response. So it depends on your population, which is why these psychometric tools for, used in psychiatry or psychological analysis or testing are pretty, distant from ideology, so that you can get a higher resolution reading of what people are really experiencing. So that study came out and showed that there was not a difference. It was independent of political party. Now, where there's some truth to it, it's still not wise to extrapolate from varying domains of psychological research to say definitively or by default that this is the truth. But there's pretty good evidence to show that liberals, especially adolescent, there's a few studies showing especially this effect in adolescent liberal girls, which is an interesting thing because like you think when you're a child or you're that young, do you really have established views? But I guess temperamentally you kind of could predict someone, will eventually become one way or the other ideologically. But there is a higher correlation between liberalism, progressivism, and trait neuroticism. So that connection's pretty established in the literature. And again, with trait neuroticism, there is a correlation with anxiety disorders, challenges with, emotion regulation, seeing things more kind of like in a negative light. There's a higher likelihood for people with that kind of profile to exhibit something called like vulnerable narcissism, which is essentially narcissism, a sort of self-elevation, but by way of, the way you reinforce that feeling is by getting people essentially to feel bad for you. So you signal your victimhood and you receive the reward for that is when people like tend to that, and it makes you feel validated essentially.
So essentially it feels good to be a victim.
Yeah.
I can relate to it. I definitely understand. I can fathom the feeling of seeking victimness in order to get some sort of attention. And you're saying that's highly correlated, or it's more correlated, let's say, with left-leaning people than it is with the right?
Well, trait neuroticism is, okay. And I want to be very careful about this because this is where this science can get super, super messy.
Sure.
A lot of what I'm saying, there are two things that are happening now. I'm inferring based on established research that liberals express higher trait neuroticism. But I'm theorizing in real time, not to say that there's not some research around some of this, but I'm theorizing real time that it is plausible, highly plausible, that there is more of an expression of vulnerable narcissism on the political left, because when you map it out, trait neuroticism, that's connected to that expression of narcissism. But that doesn't mean that the political right or people with that sort of behavioral or cognitive constellation that makes them gravitate toward the political right, it doesn't mean that they don't exhibit levels of narcissism too. But it's in some of these studies, you do see that certain levels of narcissism peek its way into more on the left when it comes to sort of saving face and kind of virtue signaling, and you don't really see that effect as much on the political right. They're not so concerned. Conservatives are not so concerned about going too far outside their sphere. They don't believe in that egalitarian diffusion of like what I do for my family, I have to extend that to, several rings out and people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Meanwhile, I live in New York City. I have to do that, No, they're pretty in their circle. So there's not a impulse to kind of signal virtue,
several circle layers later.
Out. Yeah.
You're happy to keep it with your family, your friend group.
Yeah. And there's more to it. I mean, it's really that egalitarian disposition that the political left holds
Mm.
close to as their sort of modus operandi, and that sort of necessitates this keeping up appearances. I have to look good or else, and there are several cognitive processes at play in the brain too that could explain how a person authentically feels this way, because we don't want to say that everybody on the left is like this. It's not true.
Sure.
But when you take an ecological perspective and you kind of double click on the expression of it that we're familiar with over the past decade or so with social justice types, you do see this effect of maybe, a dissonance there that you could kind of see. You could kind of see when someone's faking it. You get that feeling.
Yep.
And there's somewhat of a neural explanation for that too.
Well, what are these kind of neural or cognitive mechanisms that predict political alignment?
It's a really great question, and there's so much noise around this. And again, back to the asymmetry issue. For years, you've had social psychologists dabbling with and then getting really immersed in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and sort of marrying political science and political psychology and social psychology with neuroscience.
What is the difference?
The difference between political neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, or okay, well, it's pretty easy. It's just political psychology. It's an analysis of what political psychologists would essentially. It's just studying political psychology using fMRI and EEG and other brain measures.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, you want to understand.
So literally scanning the brain to see what somebody on the left might have high or more of in the brain versus on the right. Yeah,
right. The problem with that, though, is this started with I don't want to go too far away from your question. You asked me first about neural mechanisms.
Yeah, that kind of predict one way or the other.
One way or the other.
Mm.
Okay, so without going down a rabbit hole about where it started, I'll just get right to it because I think this is interesting. There are certainly different. So I guess we'll start with some of the more unique findings and then backtrack a bit. There are definitely different networks and different regions of the brain that are responsible or react to different stimuli, and some of that has to do. When you think about interpersonal relationships, you think about emotion regulation in the context of the self and how we think about the world internally and our own psychology versus how we emotionally regulate as a group. There are different things going on, but there are still baseline similarities. You have, your autonomic nervous system, of course, is triggered by an event, which then sends signals to, other sort of regions of the brain that are responsible for your memory, for disgust, for, it's also kicking on your executive functioning to see how you should think about it. And for people who are more extreme on one end or the other, that's a much harder part of the brain to tap into because it's inhibited by all this salience and all this activation. So, it's the long and short of it is that there's not a neural profile per se for left or right.
Okay.
A lot of it is context dependent. It depends on what you care about and what you're being tested for in the given moment. So if you are looking at racial preferences or something in a scanner, but you only have the group that your participants looking at black faces, you're not seeing how they react also to white faces or to other types of faces. Now, there is some research that does this, but for a very long time, the social neuroscience enterprise and psychology enterprise has been racism exists. It's mostly a white on black problem. So let's measure that without, again, the symmetry. And so those questions were taken to the fMRI, and of course, they would show activation in the amygdala, which a lot of people mischaracterize as only the fear center. It's really it takes in information and says this is important. Be on the lookout for it. This memory is important. This, it's sort of like an antenna that's scoping out. It could be good or bad stuff, doesn't matter. But it does have a high it does have a lot of there's a lot of significance to the amygdala when it comes to more fear-based things. That's not contended per se, but when you're finding these regions of interest, when you're putting your participants to the task or to the test, the problem that happens is they'll find a region that's activated mostly based on the experiment, and then you have to make an inference. But this is called reverse inference in neuroscience, and where you're taking the expression of a part of the brain given a certain context in the task at hand or the test at hand, and you have to infer based on what you know about the region. Okay, amygdala, salient events recorded, if you will, colloquially there, and okay, that must mean that this picture generates some kind of feeling of discomfort or some kind of just a hyper awareness of what's going on. And so I guess we can kind of approximate that there's maybe, I don't know, bias going on or some kind of, something that the person's feeling at odds with, or maybe not. But so there's a lot of inference there, and but you're not really getting to the root of the qualitative experience of the individual. You might give them some surveys after the fact to then correlate them, but even the surveys are, positioned in a way that would make it seem that a person who maybe never experienced what it's like to live in a black neighborhood, or vice versa, a black person never living in a white neighborhood, like you might find that people have a preference for living in their culture, but that's not inherently racist, right? But the way that these designs are sort of set up is that once you've got the scans and once you've got the self-reports, they're reported kind of as such. They're reported as implicit bias, and that would be fine if you were able to show the symmetry, if you're able to show that this also happens cross-culturally. You're not just seeing it in white people. But that's been the mode of operating for the social psychology world for a very long time. But that's one level of analysis, to look at the full research paradigm and to see how they sort of look at these regions of interest in the brain to then infer that, oh, this is what it means. It means that the insula is activated. The insula is connected to various parts of the brain of the body that register, disgust signals. And if your insula is going off, then it must mean you have some level of aversion for this picture or for this person. But it's just not as simple as that. These networks go off relative to the context dependent for many reasons, and we don't have a one-to-one on it,
So what I'm gathering is it's very difficult to test and isolate for this is why a person believes left or right. And it sounds like it's very easy to also manipulate, because if you make those assumptions ahead of time, you can make the data essentially say what you want it to say. So maybe if I zoom out, what's a better predictor of political motivation or political ideology? Would it be better predicted by personality styles or cognitive traits?
That's a great question. I would say, so if you're thinking about, so of political orientation, it depends on your interest. If you're interested in extremism, or if you're interested just qualitatively, how do people become liberal? How do people become conservative? Is that more of the question?
And then what is the bigger driver? Is it our mind, or is it our personality, or is it maybe something else that I'm missing? Environment.
Yeah. So there again, I mean, this is such a complex thing to dive into, but temperament, when we're born, we there's just biological factors at play. Some kids are temperamentally more anxious, some kids are temperamentally more at ease, and that's not a predictive feature per se of their politics, but you can start to architect something feasible, like some kind of hypothesis that's feasible to predict when you take their development into play. Attachment style is also something that's interesting to look into. How sort of avoidant of, how avoidant are you of conflict? How leaned in are you? How preoccupied are you with something? Are you neurodivergent? There are so many factors at play, and none of them singularly can predict political outcomes for a person. But and you also, I mean, you see even in siblings, you see differences, right? So you can't really say that it's a biological feature, right? An emergent property of a biological genotype, a genotypic kind of thing. But it does matter to some degree, the biology part of it, because how you respond to novelty is fundamentally biological. If you've higher threat sensitivity to novelty, conservatives do tend to have a much higher threat sensitivity to novelty.
Which would mean what?
Like newer. Okay, for instance, this actually is a really interesting point, because then you zoom out into the sociological and you see how conservatives do tend to cohere a sense of duty to the group that they're in, their community, the limited government. I don't want a paternalistic entity shadowing me. I want to take care of my tribe. I have a culture. The culture is a reinforcement of our values. Any violation of that is really an infraction on the culture, and the culture is meant to keep us together. Which is why you can say that a lot of conservatives are really for strong borders. There's also an evolutionary explanation to some degree of an aversion to or mitigating any outside pathogens. You can even get down to that level. And so the threat sensitivity apparatus is a bit higher. I think I misspoke and said much higher. Nothing is off the charts different between the two. There's more overlap than not, but where they diverge, it's pronounced. And for novelty, it certainly is pronounced. Novelty, new things, new people, new ideas. We want to keep it traditional. We want to keep it tight. Anything that comes in way of that is a threat. It's a signal that we have to watch out for that. And so that's why conservatives, then another level of analysis, personality psychology, that's why it would appear that it's like, you could say then, all right, conservatives score fairly low on trait openness. And trait openness would be something that would allow a person to invite novelty, new people, new ideas, new things. But that's not this. That's just generally speaking, conservatives do not score nearly as high on openness as do liberals. So, yeah, there are certain neural profiles that you can say are working to emerge some kind of thing we call the political right. But it's not a one-to-one. It's not as predictive as one might think, but it's there. And you see for both ends of the spectrum, where it gets very interesting is when you see both sides go extreme. And this is a problem with ambiguity. It's a problem with anything that challenges a perspective. And it doesn't matter if you're left or right at this point. It just matters that there's a threat to my ideology. Even if if a person has an egalitarian orientation in their politics. If you don't believe in universal health care, then it means that you don't care about the well-being of individuals, which means that you're fine with them being harmed. And because universal health care means harm reduction. So anything that pushes against that is for harm. It's selfish, you don't care, and so you're a threat. You're a useful idiot. Even if you're a good seemingly a good person, you still fall into that trap of being a useful idiot for the right. So therefore you're morally vacuous. And so it's an aversion, and hearing any other point of view is felt as a threat. It creates, there's some research on this showing that for both ends of the spectrum who are extreme, who are cognitively rigid, really what seems to be playing here is an issue with emotion regulation. Like I was saying before, the autonomic nervous system is activated when there's something, a cue in the environment that feels threatening or new or whatever, that just activates it.
And you're saying the people on the far left and far right struggle with this emotional regulation and struggle to even entertain the friendship of somebody that might have a different perspective.
Yes.
I was going to ask about this because some of my best friends in New York, which is obviously a very liberal place, are liberal. And I would lean more to the right side, but they're very left-leaning. And for me, it doesn't change a thing. I actually find it more fascinating that I can respect their knowledge and how they think so deeply, and yet still come to different conclusions than them. Even though each step along the logical processes on any given topic, we agree, the conclusion's different. And sometimes I wonder whether there's an emotional predisposition or an emotional attachment to something that, and this goes back to your cognitive dissonance piece, that they want this to be true. So even though every step logically along the way says this, I'm going to say this.
Yeah.
Is that more common on one side or the other? Or is it just at the extremes that we see that?
Well, that's a great question to tap into, because this is something I'm struggling with and trying to understand is, yes, we see both ends of the spectrum, ideological spectrum, showing rigidity and impervious to new ideas and feeling them as a threat and all that stuff. And emotion dysregulation being sort of a starting point, which then affects, actually in this one study shows that it affects the same part of the brain for both ends, really inhibiting them from opening their more executive regions, like something called the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which is basically evaluating, and it's that part of the brain, the executive part, is really the conductor, kind of saying, guys, let's take into account this, the other thing, and let's make a decision together. Let's not get rowdy. But for people who are very, very extreme, that part does not get as much glucose.
Why is that? Why does that part not get the energy it needs to kick in its executive functions?
I mean, I don't really have a good answer for that. I would only be able to surmise that, kind of going, sort of backtracking a bit to how you open this up about, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but I guess, could it be conditioned? Could it be familial? Could it be cultural? I don't think you said those things, but you alluded to something around that. And I would venture to say that most people, because most people are not extreme, I would say that this is an interesting question for psychology to look into from a clinical lens. And that's a kind of newer perspective, I think, that you don't hear, because people don't want to be pathologizing people who identify with political ideas. But there is a pathology there with political ideas. And we saw it in dictators of the past, and we see it in dictators of the present. There are pathologies that undergird ideology. And I think that my short answer is, I think that's a question that goes beyond the surface level of analysis that social psychology does, and I think would be best explored with clinicians who could try to understand why some people are just more short fused. And you probably would start to intersect with, personality disorders, mood disorders, anger problems, emotional instability, attachment disorders, things like that, and you probably would find a overpronunciation of that happening at the extremes. I'm not afraid to say that. I think some people are still kind of worried about that. But again, you have to start with an ecological lens, like I always say. Okay. Most people are not extreme. Of the people who are extreme, there's something else going on there. Because most liberals are not, force feeding you to say, mandating you or bullying you into saying certain things, like forcing you to use certain language. But of the people who are on that side who are doing it, they're doing it at very high rates, and there's a problem there. So I remember what you were saying about you started talking about how you have some friends or acquaintances or something like that where they almost want, maybe you can actually elaborate on what I'm saying now. Like you said it better. They almost want
emotionally want one outcome to be true of any issue, but logically the steps that's taken to get to that issue, they agree the other way, right? So they might agree with me the whole way going through, and then the outcome, they take it a different route, and they say, well, it must be this, which would be a more left-leaning route. And that always surprises me because I think exactly like them and they think exactly like me, but yet our outcomes on what should be done policy-wise, right, might differ. And that always intrigues me.
Right. Do you find that they or people do this also the other way around, or do you think that the effect is more pronounced on the?
Typically, I don't see people ideologically, and this is personal experience, a data point of one, I don't see people ideologically confined on the right to committing to their ideas as much.
Mm-hmm.
It's mainly on the left where I see my friends or maybe family members who will commit to one thing without having a logical basis undergirding it.
Yeah. So I think that's okay. So a few things. Yeah. This is where the differential, the asymmetry comes into play that I think once the symmetry is lined up and cleaned up from decades of bastard, just like kind of bulldozing and making conservatives all look pathological and crazy. One of the things that we can then do after that, I'm basically saying this, that anybody could do whatever they want, is to find the asymmetry. And I think that you would find the asymmetry, though, if you did a symmetrical analysis. But what I'm saying is that both sides tend to deflect or deny or employ defense mechanisms whenever their side's being challenged. And there is some new research, and I'm going to actually be interviewing one of the investigators. His name is Luke Conway. He is one of the main psychologists who is a rare voice in social psychology who studied and came up with the left-wing authoritarianism scale to be symmetrical to the right-wing one. So, but anyway, the point I'm getting to is just at base level, both ends can be censorious, high and mighty, and can push you off to the side if you reject their ideas. But I think what you're saying, and I think it's a very true point, is the way in which they do it is different. And the way the left does it tends to be, again, if you go back into the episode, we mentioned egalitarianism and sort of a more, I didn't say this then, but a redistributive sort of, everyone has to fall in line and follow these moral prescriptions, because, and that's a social signal too. If you don't, then you're going to pay a social cost. Whereas the political right, I think a lot of that happens in faith traditions where the social cost you pay could be there for sure. It's not diffuse. It doesn't spread out or leak out into your civil or civic life, your duty as an American, or your just position in society as a citizen. It does not require you to essentially shout out your praises for Jesus Christ as the Lord and Savior per se. I mean, it's part of their enclaves of of groups, of religious groups on the right, but you're going to find constitutionally sturdy people more on the right who are just more interested in essentially America as a pluralistic society that allows for many differences to flow. On the left, there's all out rejection of that, and almost you just repudiate classical liberalism. And it's been said multiple times by scholars on the left who just completely refuse to accept that this is America, that but we have to overthrow it. We have to bring in egalitarianism. And so I think the substrate is egalitarianism, and this idea that we have to impose and monitor people, impose our sort of prescriptions, like I said, and monitor people to make sure that they don't fall out of line. And if they do, then they're going to pay a social cost. So I think people are really afraid still they're afraid to jump ship on that idea or even deviate a bit, because any deviation signals insubordination. So I think that a lot of people on the left are dealing with that infrastructure. And I think that also there's a lot of people on the left who are dealing with that infrastructure but actually believe it. And so you have two types of people who are internally motivated. Their values are established as per the egalitarian mode. Okay, I believe this. Yeah, Mom Donnie, yay, free this and that, and grocery stores and buses and stuff like that. Stuff that's failed multiple times. But anyway, yeah, I'm all for that because it reduces harm. To them, it's not about the process of how to ameliorate suffering or how to attenuate the sort of capitalistic encroachment of everyday living, and or put guardrails around it so it doesn't become a pathological form of capitalism, which is, that's fine. But for them, it's about diminishing or mitigating harm, and they'll do anything possible. Get rid of capitalism. That's the reason why everybody's screwed up now. Get rid of it. So they don't care about the nuance. They believe that's their values. It's internal motivation. They have no conflict with defending that kind of thing. Sometimes even to the point of accepting it or experiencing it as a sacred template. And that's when things get extreme. Like if it establishes itself as a sacred values kind of architecture, then there's a literature which we don't have time to go into, of course, but it's called identity fusion. And it's when people can't differentiate themselves from the group. There's a oneness with the group. It's not
the idea of identity politics almost.
Yeah. If you want to think of it in shorthand like that, there's not a distinction between the two. It's not like I like my sports team and I'm rah-rah about my sports team, or I like my community, I'm rah-rah about my community. But when I walk away from those things, I'm still myself. These constituent parts come together to sort of, I'm individuated, I'm a whole person. There are different facets of my personality, of who I am as a person. I'm able to go in and out of those things healthily. But with someone with identity fusion, it's almost like being a voyeur at the movies, and you're experiencing the movie, and you're really into it. You feel like you can get connected to the characters. You feel like you are the character sometimes. Then you leave the movie, and you still kind of like feeling that feeling. And then you get to the car, you get to your house, that feeling's gone. For someone who's fused, that feeling doesn't go away. You're still in the movie. So I think for a lot of these people, when they experience someone who's intruding or dissenting, what actually happens neurally is, so they're getting activated. Their defenses are getting revved up. Their autonomic nervous system is getting revved up. And in neural readings, in brainwave readings, you see that a certain part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex becomes active, and upwards of, as short as 50 milliseconds, there's that activation. And that whole part, we don't have lots of time to deep dive into this, but that region is responsible for conflict monitoring, to kind of figure out, this is my value system, this is what I believe, something's rubbing up against it, something's wrong, there's a conflict here. And so people who are internally motivated and who believe left-wing or egalitarian motives and principles, when they come up against someone who dissents, like I just said a minute ago, they're going to really get viscerally charged and angry and completely disgusted and upset and start name-calling. But then you have people who are externally motivated, and it's just they read the script. And they've done studies that, in the same kinds of studies, they show no activation of that region of the brain. There's no conflict, but they have to perform it. And so they can only maintain that performance for so long until it crashes and burns. And then those are the virtue signaling types of people who are putting it on. And you can tell when people are doing that. I mean, it's a pretty, I don't want to say for sure you can tell, but you can kind of get a sense of it. And it's a real thing that happens. And to your earlier point about erasing, as it were, tribes, and then replacing it with either nothing, like the Land O'Lakes butter thing, which I don't think has anything in the middle anymore, and Aunt Jemima, which has, I don't know what that is even, but you're literally erasing people based on, to come full circle, this almost neurotic tendency to attenuate, the distress you're feeling for coming off the wrong way. I gotta be on this team because this is what you're supposed to believe, and this is I think this is right, and this is what I was always taught, and aren't we supposed to use the right pronouns, or aren't we supposed to? Isn't DEI good because there's preferential treatment towards whites, and isn't this instrument to fix that the way to go without even thinking about all the negative effects it has on the community you claim to care about? Yeah, so these people, when they're pushed into a corner, they could become hostile, as much as the people who are internally motivated. But there's a difference. There are people who really have a conviction and they really believe it. You can almost kind of respect the person who feels that way because they really believe it, as opposed to people who are often running the show and just trying to gain social brownie points to keep up appearances and keep up face. So it's a deeper dive than that, but that's the mini version, I would say.
Well, Anthony, thank you so much for the breakdown today. I don't think in 2 hours we can do it justice for the conversation that we want to have here, but that's time for another episode.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks for coming on. Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. If you do like content like this, please do like and subscribe. Right now, only some of our viewers are actually subscribers, so if you would click that like and subscribe button, that would really help us out.